Greetings, my name is Nick McCarthy and I'm the Director of Programming at NewFest, New York's leading LGBTQ film and media organization. Last week, we hosted the premiere of The Lady and the Dale in partnership with our friends at HBO and GLAAD, along with an exciting panel with the creators that we're delighted to share with you now. If you haven't yet watched this one-of-a-kind documentary series, please check it out on HBO and HBO Max starting January 31st, and then come back to watch this panel. And be sure to tell your friends too. Now, please enjoy this conversation with the brilliant minds behind HBO's The Lady and the Dale, moderated by consulting producer, Precious Brady-Davis.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the premiere of The Lady and the Dale. I'm Precious Brady-Davis, consulting producer and author. I am so glad to be here for this conversation today, and it was a great honor to work on The Lady and the Dale as consulting producer. Before we get started with our fabulous panelists, I want to thank HBO for streaming The Lady and the Dale. We want to thank NewFest as well as GLAAD for hosting this conversation. It is my great pleasure to introduce Zackary, Drucker, director and executive producer on The Lady and the Dale. Hi, Zackary, how are you?
Hey, Goddess, I'm good, hanging in there.
So good to see you. Let's welcome Nick Cammilleri, director and executive producer.
Hey, Precious, how you doing?
Hi, Nick, how are you?
I'm well, thank you for asking.
Thank you for being here. Let's welcome Mark and Jay Duplass, executive producers on The Lady and the Dale.
Hey, Precious.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for being here. And last but not certainly least, Susan Stryker, consulting producer on the project.
Hey, thank you, Precious. It's great to be here.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for being here. Let's jump right in. Nick, let's start with you. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of this story and how did this piece come to life?
Was started in about 2011. For context, those were kind of like the two probably most punishing years of my life. So really leaving that, I didn't really care about much at that time, and nothing really much was getting through to me. So when I saw like that Unsolved Mysteries episode, I just sat up because, you know, I love 1970s movies, and 1974 Los Angeles has a very interesting like patina to it. And I love the feel of it. And then her story was just remarkable. Everything about it was just incredible. I think I relate to it because I love underdog stories, and I love stories about the American dream, but also the time my life had a lot of tragedy in it. So when I saw this, it just cut like right through me, and I was like, I'm in. I was immediately like, I wanted this in every sense of the word. And so when I saw it the first time, and I was just thought about it. And then the second time I saw it, I was on set working somewhere, and someone showed me a video, and then the next video in the queue just randomly was that Unsolved Mysteries video again. And I was like, okay, I get it. I was just like, I get what you're trying to tell me. And then when I saw it the second time, I just thought, you know, I was like, I bet the book on this is incredible. And I went to Amazon, there was no book. And I was like, I bet the movie and subsequent documentary are even better. And there was like nothing. And then I remember having this moment where I was like, oh, I'm going to end up having to do this, aren't I? And it was just like, I don't know why I stupidly shouldered that responsibility. But I remember in that moment, I was just like, it was everything. It's just incredible. Everything about it was incredible. And I thought like, I love just her stories. I mean, it really connected with me on a level of like someone who's a survivor and a fighter and a scrapper in every sense of the word, like never conceded a day in her life. And that there are so few people like that. And I think in the sense to wrap up your question, which is like every chapter of her life could probably be someone's full life. And I just thought, you know, she lived really an enormous life. And the fact that nobody told that story, I was just like, I felt kind of an obligation.
And after you were inspired by that Unsolved Mysteries episode, did you just run with it? Did you have immediate support? Where did you go from there after the genesis of the idea that you wanted to do a documentary on Liz Carmichael?
Yeah, well, I first put together like a 25-page outline over about a year or a year and a half, just like scraping together anything. Like there were no court records. I kept being brushed up against by just anybody in the records office, like the LAPD. Like nobody wanted to really give me anything. And there was a time where I thought this might have actually been fake, and the show Unsolved Mysteries was fake. because there was literally nothing on it, to the point where I was like, is this just a myth? Because I couldn't believe how little there was. But then it took me about a year and a half to put together pretty much everything I had. And once I kind of had it together, and I saw that story, it was, I had some support from my roommate, Sarah, at the time, but there was like, but a lot of people, I'm an eccentric person. And I think a lot of people went, there's crazy Nick doing a crazy story about a lady with a 3-wheeled yellow car for the 1970s. And I was like, no, it's the greatest. And I was just like, it didn't matter. I was like, no, it's amazing. And then, because I was just like, you do it for the 12-year-old in you who wants to tell that story so badly. And so, but there were a lot of people who just kind of dismissed it, I think. And the people, I didn't really realize this till later because I wasn't thinking about it, but the people closest to me who did support it were in the LGBT community, who, wasn't something that consciously was a thought, but occurred to me later. So I had limited support and not a lot of resources. And I had this 25-page outline. And what I saw was an underdog story that was like Rocky or The Verdict. It was like, you watch somebody with 1,000,000-to-1 stakes, and it was, and putting that together. And then I didn't know anything about, like, I'd never made a documentary in my life. I just decided this was the one I was going to make, and that was it. And I was a screenwriter. That's all I did. All my friends were writers. I didn't know anything, but it sounds kind of embarrassing, but everything I learned from Mark and Jay Duplass, like, because they're on No Film School doing speeches all the time. They're here, do this and do that. And I'm not trying to be shamelessly gloating, but like, I was the guy watching these videos on the internet being like, it's a good idea, I should do that. And then I would just go do it. And because I loved like their momentum and everything they did. And I was just like, I'm just going to keep shooting and just shooting. And that's all I did, is I just grabbed cameras and I started finding people, and I just started making phone calls and letters, and you just kind of build a momentum from it. And that's all you do, is you just keep building momentum. And I just wanted to be, I would tell people, if you want to make a documentary about Liz Carmichael, you have to become Liz Carmichael, which means like you have to be indefatigable. You have to be unstoppable. And I think that it was like a rolling boulder. You just had to keep going. And I didn't know anything. So I was stealing cameras, for no offense, from different places, and and grabbing people and anybody I could get. My cameraman was my sound man. We were just pulling stuff together. It really was Operation Bootstrap in every sense of the word for like probably the first 7 years. That's all it was just shooting and grabbing stuff and grabbing people. And that sound guy could get another guy. Like, it didn't matter what it took. And at one point, I think I mentioned that like I was financing this from the settlements of car accidents that I was in, because I just grabbed any money I could get and just went, now I'm shooting. And that was pretty much it. It's just momentum.
So then Mark and Jay Duplass come along as producers on the project. Mark and Jay, and I see a lot in your work when we look at Room 104 and Wild Wild Country, that you're really drawn to the themes of finding home, as well as being displaced in some aspects. Can you talk to me about that? And was there some sense of that in The Lady in the Dale, of what drew you to this project? Why The Lady in the Dale for your next project after Wild Wild Country?
That's a good question.
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if we're very subjective, I think, in just what we like and what we want to do and who we want to work with. I think when Nick first brought us this idea, honestly, our first reaction was similar to Nick's early reaction was, is this real? Like, I've never heard of this. You look it up, you can't really find that much. And there's not a lot of footage of her. And we were like, how much is there? Is this a short doc? Is it a feature? Is it a miniseries? Obviously, we were riveted by her and her story. She's one of the most fascinating human beings to ever live on planet Earth. And, we're definitely interested in, I mean, that for me, at least, I don't know about you, Mark, but just Liz herself was just a riveting human being. And that's what just got me peaked.
Yeah, I think so. And then I think that we all collectively, not just Jay and myself, but everyone at our company and the people we started to talk to about the idea, we kind of felt a little embarrassed or ashamed that we had not heard of Liz and had not heard of her story, and felt like, how did we miss this? And the more we started talking to people, we started to realize that very few people, if any, had heard of her. It was almost as if she had been erased from the history books or just put out for some reason. And then the excitement started to turn very quickly to a sense of sadness, and then emboldening into some sort of sense of duty to her to tell this story. And I think that, it's been a crazy couple of years, and Jay and I and everyone at our company have been thinking a lot about what are the kinds of stories that we want to tell, what are the kinds of stories that are important to tell, who are the right kinds of people to tell those stories. And we feel like if we have, just being candid, anything to offer as cis white dudes in the world, we should be taking our platform and telling stories of people who haven't had that light shown on them before. And I think that, once we saw what Nick had built up to this point, and once Jay said, I think we should do this, and I think we need to call Zackary because Zackary is going to be the person that ties this thing together. Because if there's one thing that Jay and I have figured out in our 15 years in this business, it is there are certain things that we know how to do well. And whenever we try to fake what we don't know how to do, we fail miserably. So we quickly turn to Zackary and we're like, help. Because we really want to get this story out there, but we don't know how to do this in the right way.
So, Zackary, where are we in this moment?
Oh my God.
As we come to this caper of Elizabeth Carmichael, what is the relevance of Liz Carmichael? And Susan, I'd love to hear what you have to say on this as well. What is the relevance of Liz Carmichael in the canon of trans history?
Yeah, within the scope of Liz's life, we're living in the future. This is 2021. Liz passed over 15 years ago. And in Liz's time, there were certain advantages and disadvantages of existing before the trans tipping point. I think that the future is sort of better and worse simultaneously for all things, and the trans experience is no exception. Liz was able to slip under the radar largely because people did not have trans folks in their communities or in their imagination even. The FBI kind of lost Liz's trail when she transitioned. They continued to pursue Vivian. And in the early 70s, when you read the FBI files, they identify that Vivian lived with an Elizabeth Carmichael. They couldn't find anything out about Elizabeth Carmichael. And they just couldn't, create room in their imaginations for the fact that Liz had, been Jerry Dean Michael, who they were pursuing for a number of years. That allowed Liz to put herself out there and not necessarily be read as trans. And of course, today, fast forward to 2021, trans identities are kind of at the center of the culture wars. I think that trans folks represent a modernizing world, a world of new possibility where our life experiences are not dictated by our biology. And we've taken it, to a place that I'm sure Liz would not have been able to imagine. When Jay called me about this project, I thought, why this story? I think as trans folks, we often have our own sort of short list of archetypes and heroes. And I had a lot to learn, truthfully. I think that the spirit of Liz Carmichael was actually banging on Earth's door, demanding that her story be told respectfully and with the dignity that she was not given in her lifetime. And it's also incredible to witness the kind of evolution of opinions on trans people. In the last episode, we explore the time when Liz was found in Dale, Texas in 1989. And that local news footage goes even beyond what Dick Carlson was, and the ways that Dick was talking about her in the 70s. It was actually somehow even more transphobic in the late 80s. And then, of course, we, continued to investigate the legacy of the Carlson men, and into Tucker Carlson's kind of opinion-based journalism, which is, so deeply entrenched in his father's trans misogyny and transphobia.
It's one of my favorite pieces in the doc itself, to see that interesting parallel, that to see that the legacy of Dick Carlson, that it continues, in his son Tucker, even today, to see that transphobia is still being perpetuated. Susan, I want to jump over to you. And speaking of trans folks and our depictions in media, so often we see that trans folks, that we are erased, a part of the history. And in The Lady and the Dell, there is so much archival footage that we see of Liz in the 1970s presenting herself as this trans media mogul. And can you talk a little bit about how trans folks are documented in archival history?
Sure. The thing I maybe would start out saying is that being a trans woman of a certain age, I remember when Liz hit the media back in the 70s, and mostly what I remember is the Dale. I think I probably actually saw that episode of Price is Right where the Dale comes, it's a new car, but it's like I don't have a lot of strong memories of Liz as a trans person. It's like I remember Renee Richards, who also has a little piece in this story that we're telling here. I remember a few other moments of trans history because I was in my mid-teens at that point. But what I remember is that when Liz was revealed as being trans, that my sense as a pre-transitional closeted trans person is kind of like, yeah, exactly right, that's why you keep your head down. This is like a dangerous thing that'll like totally mess up your life, and see what happens when people know that you're trans. That was my takeaway point. But it's like it wasn't anything that I really thought about for a long time. And when then Zackary came to me and said, hey, as a trans historian, we'd love to get you involved in this project that we're doing. Do you know anything about Liz Carmichael? And it was like, oh yeah, the Dale Carr thing. And I just thought of it as kind of like a minor, kind of like, oh yeah, like that was a little flash in the pan, back in the day. But then when I saw all of the really amazing material that Nick had pulled together, and for the first time in my life, got a really a rich sense of like how complicated the story was, and really what an amazing person Liz was, as we say in the film. It's like, it's not necessarily a life that you might want to aspire to. I mean, she was a criminal on the run, and at the same time, she had this kind of like outlaw, badass, chutzpah, that she was, she lived large, and there's something just really captivating about her story.
But in the film, you really humanize her, and your commentary takes us out of her capers, and I'm really interested in that. And so it made me think of modern issues of trans incarceration, misgendering. Can you talk a little bit about why that is important, that we humanize Liz Carmichael's story?
Yeah, well, it's like I think I think the film does a really good job. You said, thank you for saying that I, kind of help humanize her, but I think that all of the talking heads in the film, who are all, the experts who come in to talk about Liz's life, the only people who are not directly related to the story, like her kids and coworkers and all that, are trans women who are reflecting on what it's like to be a trans woman and how we get represented in the media and misrepresented in the media. So that I think is just such a profound shift in the way that trans media works. I think after transparent, after disclosure, that there is this kind of newfound sensibility of trans people need to be kind of centered in how we tell stories about transness. So, I just think the Lady in the Dale did an amazing job of that. So, kudos to all involved. And that it is important to bring out the you called it the humanness, but just like that, these are real people with real issues in their lives. They can get caught up in the system, their transness can put them on the outs in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it's people make bad decisions, but that doesn't mean they're bad people, and so to be able to show all of that, to show the systems that oppress trans people, that marginalize trans people, to show how media can mainstream mass media, has had this power to say what the meaning of our lives has been. It's it's been a framework that we haven't been able to contest. And I think this film does, this series does such a great job of blowing up the mainstream media narratives around trans people, and to basically say it's kind of this isn't a representation of a trans person. What we are seeing in the way Liz was demonized back in the 70s is a representation of white cis het patriarchal transphobia enacting itself against trans people. It's and the film is able to show that. It's we are able to show this isn't us. This is how we've been misrepresented by people who are actually hostile to us.
And I
That's
think
powerful.
And I think that we see that. We see that, with Dick Carlson. We see that with Mark Lecheron in the piece. And speaking of disclosures, we talk about future methods of documenting trans folks. Zackary, can you talk a little bit about the open transphobia and the misgendering that you include in the piece from people who interacted with Liz while she was alive? Talk a little bit about the thought process to include that in the piece, in the film.
I mean, it's just embedded into the story. It's baked in. When Nick and I were interviewing all of the subjects in 2019, I was astounded sitting in rooms with mostly folks who probably didn't realize that they were in the room with a trans person, and perhaps even if they had realized, they would have continued to kind of articulate negative and biased views against trans people. And so I was somewhat astounded about what people would say, not realizing. And it was a tremendous learning experience for me. I think I learned a lot about, my own family, and how the legacies of trans people are mired in people's kind of inability to fully accept trans folks as human. So it was tough at times, and we didn't include everything, obviously. I mean, we had a huge amount of material. I thought that, there are so many ways to situate and talk about transness, and they are sometimes harsh. It's I mean, I don't think that we could have avoided it. I mean, this is a 4-hour series about one particular trans person, which to my knowledge has not been done before. And it was it was a challenge. I mean, there's certain things that are unavoidable, that you cannot kind of pivot around. And I feel like all of that complexity and all of those layers are in our series.
Mark and Jay, can you talk a little bit about the advantages of working in the medium of documentary versus something that is scripted? And specifically in The Lady and the Dell, and I'll open this to the wider panel as well, animation really drives the story forward. And can you talk a little bit about the impact of that and how it really tells Liz's story in a fresh new way?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, just speaking candidly, the freedom of narrative filmmaking is just a hell of a lot easier than documentary filmmaking, because you can sculpt and shape and lie and maneuver everything you need to do. But when it comes down to the documentaries, you are beholden a lot of times to not only what the empirical truth is, but what footage you actually have, particularly archival footage. And as relatively well documented as Liz's life was for that time, and for her being a trans figure, there are certainly gaps. And so early on in the process, this idea was floated about using animation as a storytelling tool to not only cover some informational gaps, but also to allow more of an emotional connection, and for someone to be able to try to access your way into Liz. Because I think that something, I honestly had a blind spot even going into this documentary about what it truly meant to have Liz Carmichael, who is an inherently very complicated person in all the wonderful ways that you normally want one of your protagonists in a story to be, whether it's a documentary, whether it's a film. We have honored complicated protagonists, particularly, they've just been traditionally white males for a long time, in cinema forever. Yet we realized at a certain point that this was going to be a relatively novel thing, to have a super complicated trans person be the center of our narrative. And in order to do that, we were going to need some extra tools in order to bring the audience in, due to some of the footage that we didn't really have, due to the nature of the gaps in the archives. As we've said, Liz was kind of erased from the history books in some ways. So it came out to be this actually really interesting tool. So while you've got all these wonderful archival material, and I forget, I wish I could give the credit, I don't know whose idea it was at first to come up with the animation. It really provided this wonderful counterbalance for less of an informational inroad, but more of an emotional inroad into Liz.
Jay, did you want to add to that question before we go to the rest of the team and discuss the animation?
Sure. I just want to say that I thought Nick's and Zackary's collaboration on the animation, in a way, they really, I mean, because they're such students of Liz and know her personality so well, I just was so tickled and pleased at how not only it brought the character and the moments to life, but how they captured the fun and the joy and the humor of Liz Carmichael. I watched the final product with my wife recently, and she was just amazed with the animation and just kept saying how, like, I feel like I know her, and so I'm just so proud of what they accomplished.
So Zackary and Nick, can you talk a little bit about that animation? And to Jay's point, the series really takes on family trauma in a new way that I don't think that I've seen that kind of passed down, heavy, complicated family generational trauma. So can you talk a little bit about how the series takes on family trauma, and talk a little bit about the animation as well?
Yeah, I'll say that shout out to Awesome and Modest, the animation team, and the character animation for Liz was done by Des Stavakos, who's a trans animator. based in New York, we had so many gaps in representations of Liz, primarily in, her 20s, 30s, and later in life. So we worked with Des to kind of create, a whole spectrum of versions of Liz, from Jerry Dean in her early years, and all of the kind of bombastic trouble Jerry Dean was getting into, to Liz late in life. It kind of offered an opportunity to imagine the emotional space of Liz, which was so kind of unreachable largely through the archival, because she's so tough and she's so indomitable. I think that we really explored how would Liz tell her story, and arrived at this kind of scrappy DIY style. You may notice that everything is paper based, so it's very tactile, it's very analog. That was kind of the rules of the animation, was that everything was, collage and paper based. And then our family members are embedded in this story as well, because so many folks are implicated in, misdemeanors or felonies. Both my grandparents are counterfeiters, as well as my great grandfather. We have family members who are jurors and journalists, and throughout the entire series, the crew's family members and our own personal archives are in the animation. So yeah, there was that piece. And then what was your other question? It was about family trauma. I think that Candy Michael says it best at the end of the series, which is that, trauma is epigenetic, it is inherited, it is something that is passed down, and a bad decision by your, parent or grandparent can cascade and affect future generations. I think that we really wanted to respect Liz's living family members, and not kind of exploit elements of their story that were more painful, while also really keeping the spotlight on Liz and unpacking her legacy as not only a trans person and entrepreneur, but also as a family member. We are all part of families. So many trans and non-binary people are expelled from their families and have to create chosen families, and the communities that they find themselves in. And it's remarkable how Liz was able to bring everybody in to be like the unifying kind of matriarch of her family, and it's exceptional. I mean, I think that the tenacity that Liz demonstrates in the first episode, so many themes that are common in trans life, employment discrimination, and you imagine that Liz had to feed an entire family, that she was transitioning and doing it in her own kind of clandestine, self-created way, but was still responsible for the livelihood of her 5 children and partner, Vivian. So, I think that we've come a long way in certain areas, but that Liz's story is as prescient today as it was in the last century. That many of those themes are still common in trans life today.
And in that, I feel that you're giving Liz a final resting place. It reminds me of one of the phrases that we say in the trans community, that we want to give people their flowers while they can still smell them. And it's so funny that we see in the documentary itself, that Liz herself, that she sold flowers herself, and, and ran a flower business. And I just want to close it with this question to the panel. What is the legacy of Liz Carmichael, and where do we go from here after we brought her out of the distance?
I would just like to say that I hope from here, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, somebody looks back at this panel and sees us maybe lightly patting ourselves on the back for having a very complicated trans protagonist at the center of our story and says, God, that's so dated. We've been doing that for years now. Can you believe back that only 5 or 10 years ago, that was an anomaly? I think Liz would enjoy that.
I hope so.
Oh,
And I think, we often think that, trans history is so obscure or rare or hard to find. And, when you open your eyes, it's like, it's all around us. It's been around us for a long time. It's a part of human culture, and that, it's like to just be able to like tell the story of a trans person who was doing like some interesting things in life, having a complicated life, but having a compelling life. It's like, yeah, like I think it's like if this project can be part of, in some ways, just documenting the persistent presence of trans people and our simultaneously sort of extraordinary and ordinary lives, like our work will be well done.
Nick, you want to say something?
yeah, no, I was gonna say that mine was, I guess, maybe on a much more granular level or smaller level, which is that like, I think the biggest thing I took away was that survival is heroism, and I think that like that took me, a lot of I learned a lot of that humanity from Zackary, from the experiences that I'll never have, which was like to understand what it took. In the documentary, it's saying like there was no playbook or rule book on like how to transition or how to live that life, and it's like, and to feel like that's what we left behind was to watch someone step by step, become their best self or live wholehearted, and to me, I thought the everyday choice to be Liz Carmichael every day, despite knowing what you would be up against every day, I thought was like, it brought me to tears towards the end, because I was like, that's the most courageous thing, is to wake up every day to make the choice to be Liz Carmichael, because I wake up every day and I'm like, oh, I gotta be Nick again. And it's like, and to think, Liz Carmichael did that fearlessly, was every day nonstop. And I just stand by what I said. Survival is heroism. And that's what I took away.
I would just add that, Liz's legacy is the legacy of so many trans and gender expansive people through time. I feel like stories about trans resilience are the most powerful stories in the world. And Liz is no exception. Her survival into her 70s is a victory in and of itself.
I completely agree. Thank you so much, Zackary. What a wonderful place to end and wrap this conversation. Survival is heroism. Thank you all for everything that you did to make this film and documentary come to life. Thank you to GLAAD for hosting this conversation. Thank you to NewFest for hosting the platform. Thank you to HBO and HBO Max for streaming the series. I am so excited to watch it on my TV. I love the series, and I think it's fantastic, and I could not agree more that survival is heroism, and that Liz is a powerful narrative of authenticity and remembering where we come from and where we're going, as Susan so wonderfully talked about on this panel. I leave you with the words of Candy Michael as seen in the documentary. The woman was a woman, and the car was a car. Thank you all so much for Lady and the Dell.
Thanks,
Precious.
Precious.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.